I saw my mother by chance, rummaging through rotten produce at a farmer's market. I was frozen, and when I asked her, "Mom, what are you doing here? What happened?" she answered, with a face pale with terror. "The car and the house you gave me, your husband and your mother-in-law took them from me. They seized everything." In that instant, I felt the blood boil in my veins. I told her not to worry, Mom, that I would take care of everything. Before the story begins, please write in the comments which city you are watching this story from. Do not forget to like and subscribe so this channel can continue to grow and bring you even more fascinating stories. The morning sun was not yet intense when Madison decided to park her luxury sedan in a spot somewhat distant from the entrance of the downtown market. She adjusted her simple yet elegant dress before getting out of the car. That day, without knowing quite why, she had felt the urge to do the shopping herself. She longed for the home-cooked meals her mother used to make for her when they were still struggling. This market was the largest in the city, a bustling hub where the pulse of ordinary people beat every day. The smell of fresh fish, mixed with the aroma of damp earth and spices, assaulted Madison's senses as soon as she stepped inside. The ground, still wet from the remnants of the previous night's rain, forced her to walk carefully so as not to stain the hem of her dress, but she did not feel a hint of disgust. To her, the market was an honest place, very different from the world of business, full of falsehood, in which she moved daily. Madison walked down the aisle of vegetable stands, buying some bell peppers, a few ears of sweet corn, and a good-sized wheel of sharp Vermont cheddar. The friendly smiles of the vendors comforted her. However, her steps came to a dead halt as she headed towards the back of the market, the area where the dumpsters with unsold merchandise were accumulated. In a dirty, foul-smelling corner, Madison saw the figure of an older woman dressed in rags, rummaging through a pile of Swiss chard that was already beginning to rot. The old woman selected the leaves she thought could still be cooked and put them into a wrinkled black plastic bag. Madison's heart skipped a beat. The woman's posture, the way she stooped slightly, was terribly familiar. She narrowed her eyes, trying to sharpen her vision amidst the bustle of people passing by her indifferently. When the old woman turned for a moment to wipe the sweat from her forehead, Madison's heart seemed to stop. That face was the face she missed so much. It was the face of Eleanor, her own mother. Her legs grew weak, and the shopping bags nearly fell from her hands. She could not believe what she was seeing. Wasn't her mother supposed to be living comfortably in the beautiful house she had gifted her a year ago? Didn't she have a car and a driver ready to take her wherever she wanted? Why was she now in the garbage area of a market, collecting rotten vegetables like a homeless woman with no family? Tears began to well up in her eyes, but she held them back with all her might. Surprise gave way to a sharp pain that pierced her chest. She ran towards the old woman, no longer caring about the mud soiling her shoes. When she was beside her, she called her name in a trembling voice. Eleanor turned, her nearsighted eyes trying to focus on the young woman before her. When she recognized her daughter, her face turned white as a sheet. A dreadful fear was reflected in her gaze, as if she had been caught committing a crime, when in reality she was the victim. Madison hugged her tightly, not caring about the smell of garbage or her mother's dirty clothes. Eleanor's body felt frail and thin, barely skin and bones. Madison's sobs broke on her mother's shoulder. When she calmed down a bit, she released the hug and looked her mother squarely in the eyes. With her voice breaking with anger and sadness, she asked what had happened. Eleanor lowered her head. Her trembling hands clutched the plastic bag. In a whisper, her face pale with fear, she began to tell her that the house and the car Madison had given her were no longer hers. They had taken everything. Her husband, Ethan, and her mother-in-law, Gertrude, had seized it all. Madison's jaw dropped as if a lightning bolt had struck her in broad daylight. How was this possible? She sent more than enough money for her mother every month through Ethan's account. He had told her he would take care of all of Eleanor's needs, so Madison could focus on her work. Eleanor continued her story haltingly. A week after Madison gave her the deed to the house and the keys to the car, Ethan and Gertrude appeared. They forced her to sign papers she did not understand. They told her they were property tax documents, but in reality, they were the papers for the change of title. After the signing, Gertrude kicked her out of the house, saying they were going to use it for a family investment. Ethan took the car with the excuse that he needed it for his business. Eleanor did not dare to say anything to Madison because Gertrude had threatened her. "If you say a word, I will make Ethan divorce her and her life will be a living hell," she had said. For her daughter's happiness, Eleanor chose to remain silent and leave, living like a vagrant, renting a tiny room on the outskirts of town with the few dollars she had. Madison's blood boiled hearing this. She clenched her fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She felt foolish for having blindly trusted her husband. She felt like a bad daughter for having allowed her mother to suffer to protect the feelings of a husband and a mother-in-law who turned out to be wolves in sheep's clothing. She took the bag of rotten vegetables from her mother's hands and threw it far away. She told her firmly that from that moment on, her mother would never eat garbage again. She promised her she would fix everything. She swore to God that every tear her mother shed would be paid for dearly by those who had hurt her. As Madison comforted her mother, a luxury sedan drove slowly down the avenue in front of the market, stuck in traffic. Madison recognized the license plate. It was one of her company cars, the one Ethan often used. The windows were not too dark. In a gap in the traffic, she could clearly see who was inside. At the wheel was Ethan, her husband, who always claimed to be busy in business meetings. Beside him, a young woman with long hair, Sienna, was laughing hysterically. They looked incredibly happy. Ethan's hand was caressing Sienna's. That image burned away the last remnants of doubt in Madison's heart. Her husband was not only a thief but also a traitor. She quickly pulled her mother to hide behind a concrete pillar so Ethan would not see them. She did not want a confrontation there. She did not want Ethan to know she had found Eleanor. If he found out, they would surely concoct another twisted plan to cover their tracks. Madison had to play it smart. She was a successful businesswoman, accustomed to ruthless competition, and now she would use that skill to punish her husband and her mother-in-law. She took out her phone and dialed a number she trusted completely. She called David, her lawyer and business advisor. In a cold, serene voice, she asked him to prepare a safe place for her mother and to begin investigating all the assets Ethan had fraudulently transferred. She led Eleanor to her car, treating her like a queen, opening the door for her and helping her into the comfortable seat. Inside, she wiped the tears from her mother's cheeks with a wet wipe. She saw her mother's hands, rough and full of scratches. Her soul ached, but her determination was unshakable. The docile and naive Madison was gone. From that day on, she would become Ethan and Gertrude's worst nightmare. She looked at her mother and told her softly but firmly to calm down, that she would get back everything that was hers and much more. In her mind, she began to weave a plan that did not involve physical violence, but a financial trap that would make them regret for the rest of their lives ever having played with fire. The journey to the safe place was silent but filled with emotion. Eleanor still seemed in shock, as if she could not believe that her suffering had finally come to light. Madison held her hand the entire way, transmitting her strength. In her head, the script for her revenge began to take shape. She would not confront them directly. That would be too easy. She would let them soar high on their greed, only to make them fall just when they thought they had it all. Madison started the engine, and the car slowly pulled away, leaving behind the market that had been a silent witness to the heart-wrenching reunion of a mother and daughter, separated by the wickedness of their closest relatives. After ensuring Eleanor was safe in a secure apartment, watched over by David's trusted people, Madison returned to her luxurious home. She paused for a moment in front of the imposing gate, taking several deep breaths. She had to transform her face. The rage, disgust, and hatred boiling in her chest had to be buried under the mask of a submissive and devoted wife. This was the hardest part of her plan. She had to act as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just seen her mother collecting garbage or her husband kissing another woman. She entered the house with a smile she had rehearsed in the car's rear-view mirror. In the living room, Ethan and Gertrude were sitting comfortably, enjoying tea and expensive pastries. A gossip show was on the television. The scene contrasted brutally with the state of her mother, who had been starving just hours before. Gertrude saw Madison arrive and immediately put on an expression of false sweetness. She greeted her in a cloying tone, asking how her day at the office had been. Ethan also got up from the sofa, walked over, and gave her a kiss on the forehead, a gesture that now made Madison's stomach churn. However, she did not push him away. She returned their smiles with a deceptive kindness, saying that work had gone well and that she had just closed a very profitable meeting. She sat in a single armchair opposite her mother-in-law and her husband. She opened the conversation by going straight for the jugular, though with the most innocent voice she could feign, asking how her mother was, saying she had not been able to visit her for a long time because of work. Ethan seemed to tense for a second, but composed himself instantly. With astonishing fluency, he lied, saying that Eleanor was wonderful. He even invented that his mother-in-law had called him that very morning to say how happy she was enjoying her retirement, tending to the flowers in the garden of her new house. Gertrude chimed in enthusiastically, adding that Eleanor always sent her regards and asked that Madison not worry about visiting because she was very busy with the activities of the new neighborhood's church. Hearing that string of well-woven lies, Madison felt the blood rush to her head. How evil the human beings in front of her could be. They could smile and lie without the slightest scruple after having made an old woman suffer, but Madison maintained her smile. She nodded as if she believed every word. Then, Ethan got to the point, the topic that truly interested him. Under the pretext of the difficult economic situation, he said he needed extra capital for his real estate business, which was supposedly going through a rough patch. He asked Madison to transfer a considerable amount of money to his personal account. Gertrude supported him, insisting that, as a good wife, Madison had an obligation to help her husband to maintain the family's honor. Madison pretended to consider it. Inside, she was laughing cynically. What real estate business? She knew that Ethan's businesses were just a front for his laziness. That money would undoubtedly be for splurging with Sienna and paying off the debts from his ostentatious lifestyle. However, she agreed to the request. She said she would prepare the money, but that she needed a couple of days to liquidate a certificate of deposit. Ethan and Gertrude's faces lit up. They looked at each other with an expression of victory, believing that Madison was still the foolish cow they could milk at will. Madison excused herself to go up to her room to shower and rest, leaving them to celebrate their fleeting victory. That night, when Ethan was fast asleep, snoring loudly, Madison got up silently. She picked up Ethan's briefcase, which was carelessly thrown on the dresser. With extreme care, she opened it and reviewed its contents. She found a stack of unpaid credit card bills and receipts for the payments on a luxury car registered in someone else's name. And most painfully, she found the original deed to the house she had bought for her mother. The deed already had a new owner, Gertrude. The name change had been done either by forging Eleanor's signature or under duress the day they kicked her out. Madison photographed all the documents as evidence. She also found a paper with notes of debts to loan sharks with exorbitant interest rates. It turned out that Ethan and Gertrude's luxurious lifestyle was built on a mountain of debt, and they were counting on Madison's assets to plug the holes. The next morning, Madison met with David in his office. The lawyer handed her a complete report, the result of an express investigation he had conducted overnight. The report confirmed that Ethan had a mistress named Sienna, who lived in a luxury apartment. The rent for that apartment was paid with money diverted from Madison's company, disguised as expenses for a new branch. David also gave her even more alarming news. Eleanor's house, now in Gertrude's hands, was already on a private sale list to cover an urgent debt Ethan owed to a loan shark. There were only 48 hours left before the house would pass into the hands of a ruthless third party. If that happened, it would be much more difficult to recover it. Madison looked at David with a sharp, calculating gaze. She realized she could not wait any longer. She had to accelerate her plan. She asked David to draft a trap business contract. The agreement had to seem incredibly attractive, as if Madison were going to grant Ethan and Gertrude high-level positions in her company with fantastic salaries and all kinds of luxuries. But hidden in the contract, there had to be clauses written in convoluted legal language. The essence of these clauses was that the signatories would assume full responsibility for the debts of a fictitious company and would pledge all their personal assets as an irrevocable guarantee. Madison wanted them to voluntarily return what they had stolen without them realizing it. David, who understood Madison's move perfectly, accepted the request with a slight smile. He admired Madison's composure in facing the storm of her marriage. He promised her that the document would be ready that same afternoon. Madison returned home with a new strategy. On the way, she stopped at a high-end jewelry store, not to buy, but to pick up a high-quality replica. She had a plan to bait Gertrude's greed and lower her guard even further. Upon arriving home, she saw Gertrude yelling at the housekeeper over some trifle. She approached her mother-in-law and handed her a jewelry box containing a rhinestone brooch that looked authentic and very expensive. Gertrude stopped yelling instantly at the sight of the glittering gems. Her eyes widened with greed. Madison told her it was a small gift for taking care of Ethan and for praying for Madison's success. Gertrude accepted it jubilantly, running to look at herself in the mirror without uttering a sincere thank you. Ethan, seeing his mother so happy, also approached. It was then that Madison cast her main bait. With a serious but enthusiastic face, she told them that her company had just won the bid for a national project valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. She wanted to share this blessing by appointing Ethan as CEO and Gertrude as chairwoman of the board of a new subsidiary that would manage the project. Upon hearing the words CEO, chairwoman, and the figure of hundreds of millions, Ethan and Gertrude took the bait as if there were no tomorrow. Their egos inflated like balloons. Ethan already pictured himself as a great boss, respected by all. Gertrude saw herself as a grand dame, showing off to her friends at the country club. They swallowed the bait whole without chewing. They asked when the inauguration would be. Madison replied that the following night she would organize a special dinner for the signing before a notary and to celebrate their new positions. She stressed that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and that they should prepare all the documents of their personal assets as a mere administrative formality. Ethan and Gertrude agreed without hesitation, not realizing they were digging their own graves to an abysmal depth. That night, Madison slept much more peacefully, knowing that the spider's web was perfectly woven. That afternoon, the sky seemed overcast, as if in solidarity with Madison's stormy mood. After getting the full address from David, she decided to drive to a luxurious apartment building in the city center. This was where Sienna lived, the woman who had destroyed the happiness of her marriage. According to David's report, the apartment Sienna occupied was, in fact, leased in the name of Madison's company, falsifying the expense as the rent for a new branch office. Madison felt like an idiot. She had been too busy trusting others and had not realized that rats were gnawing at her own granary. She parked in the visitors area and put on a face mask and sunglasses to avoid being recognized. She had no intention of making a scene. She had gone to confirm a crucial detail that would become the ace up her sleeve. David had already arranged for Madison to access audio recordings from inside the apartment through a microphone. His men, posing as air conditioning technicians, had installed that very morning. She sat inside her soundproof car and put on the headphones. Her heart pounded as she turned on the receiver. A few seconds of static gave way to a clear conversation. It was Ethan's voice. He was complaining about how tired he was. He said that pretending in front of Madison was getting more exhausting every day, that she was too smart and was starting to ask too many questions about the finances. A female voice responded with a syrupy and slightly petulant tone. It had to be Sienna. Sienna was rushing Ethan to divorce Madison once and for all. She said she was tired of living in hiding as if she were stolen goods. She wanted to appear in public as Ethan's wife and enjoy his fortune without having to hide. Ethan tried to calm her with empty promises, assuring her that very soon all of Madison's assets would be in his mother Gertrude's hands, so his legal position would be secure before filing for divorce. But what made Madison's blood run cold was the diabolical plan they discussed next. Sienna suggested that Ethan start putting a drug in Madison's drink every night. She mentioned a type of high-dose sedative that could make a person lose concentration, have hallucinations, and gradually appear to be suffering from a mental disorder. The goal was perverse. If Madison was declared incapacitated or with severe depression, the management of all company assets and marital property could fall to Ethan as her legal guardian. Madison gripped the steering wheel tightly. She could not believe her husband was capable of such evil. That plan sought not only to steal her fortune but to destroy her life and her sanity completely. A tear of rage rolled down her cheek, but she wiped it away immediately. She could not afford to be weak. The recording of that conversation was being automatically saved to the cloud, accessible to her and David. The conversation continued. The sound of Ethan's footsteps was heard as he left. He had to go back home so Madison would not suspect anything. After the sound of the door closing, there was a brief silence. Madison thought Sienna would go to rest, but suddenly a phone rang. Sienna answered. Her tone of voice changed completely. It was now firm and cold, nothing like the pampered voice she used with Ethan. She was talking to someone on the other end of the line, telling them her plan was going smoothly. She said that the idiot Ethan believed, hook, line, and sinker, that the child she was expecting was his. Madison held her breath. A new fact came to light. Sienna was pregnant, and the baby was not Ethan's. Sienna let out a malicious laugh, saying that Ethan was just a bridge to get the money and that the baby's biological father was someone else, who was apparently also waiting for his share of the loot. This information was a nuclear weapon for Madison. Ethan, who thought he was so clever for cheating on his wife, was being cheated on in the crudest way by his own mistress. He was willing to kick his mother-in-law out onto the street and betray his wife for a woman who was not even faithful to him. Madison felt a mixture of disgust and pity for her husband's stupidity. She turned off the listening device, feeling she had heard enough filth for one day. She took off her mask and sunglasses and looked at herself in the rearview mirror. Her face looked tired, but her gaze was sharp and full of determination. She promised herself that she would let Ethan know the truth about Sienna at the last moment, when he had absolutely nothing left, so his pain would be complete. She drove her car away from that luxurious apartment building. Her mind was now focused on the next step. She had to protect herself immediately from the drugging plan. From that night on, she would not drink or eat anything prepared by Ethan or by the house staff who might have been bribed, unless she saw the preparation process or did it herself. She would also replace all the drinks in her room with new ones she would buy and keep in a secret place. She called David to inform him that she had the recording with the criminal plan and the truth about Sienna's pregnancy. On the other end of the phone, David sounded furious but reminded Madison to stay calm and stick to the plan. The next act was about to begin, and it would be the most satisfying trap of all. When she got to the office, she did not start working immediately. She sat in her executive chair, contemplating the city through the large window. She remembered the face of her mother, Eleanor, terrified in the market. That pain became the fuel that made her stronger. She called her secretary and asked her to bring the files for the shell company that David's legal team had prepared. It was an instrumental company, an empty corporation created to appear solvent, but which actually had enormous, legally incurred liabilities, designed for specific business strategies. Madison was going to use that company as the tomb for Ethan and Gertrude's greed. She reviewed the documents page by page, making sure there was not a single loophole for them. Every signature they put on paper that night would be a nail in their bankrupt coffin. That evening, Madison returned home a little later than usual, deliberately making Ethan and Gertrude wait. When she entered, the atmosphere was tense. They were impatient for the promise of the big project, but Madison acted naturally. She carried a thick, very exclusive-looking leather briefcase. Ethan received her with exaggerated kindness, even offering her a glass of orange juice that was already served on the table. Madison looked at the glass, remembering the plan she had overheard. She delicately refused it, claiming an upset stomach from drinking too much coffee at the office. She asked for a bottle of mineral water that was still sealed. Ethan's face showed a slight disappointment, but he could not insist. Madison smiled to herself. She had thwarted the first attempt to destroy her reputation. Now it was her turn to launch a mortal attack through the papers she held in her hand. The atmosphere in the dining room that night was designed to look formal but cozy. The crystal chandelier on the ceiling shone brightly, its light reflecting on the expensive porcelain dinnerware that was rarely used. Gertrude, sitting at the head of the table with her chin held high and wearing the imitation diamond brooch Madison had given her, already felt like a grand dame. Ethan, to her right, wore his best shirt, trying to affect the dignity of a young executive. Madison sat opposite them, serene and in control. She placed the thick leather briefcase in the center of the table, making it the focus of all eyes. The delicious food being served seemed of no interest to either Ethan or his mother. Their eyes were fixed on those documents. Madison began the conversation in a serious but convincing tone. She explained that the new company she was launching would be dedicated to exporting raw materials, with a value of hundreds of millions of dollars. She said that foreign investors demanded that the board of directors be composed of people with a solid personal net worth as a guarantee of integrity. She looked Ethan directly in the eye and told him she trusted no one more than her own husband to occupy the position of CEO. Ethan puffed out his chest, his ego perfectly massaged. Then Madison turned to Gertrude, telling her that a mother's wisdom was indispensable in the position of chairwoman of the board to oversee the proper running of the company. Gertrude smiled from ear to ear, revealing her dentures. She nodded, delighted with the false praise. Then, Madison pulled out 2 thick stacks of documents from the briefcase. The documents were dense, filled with very complex legal and financial terminology. Madison knew perfectly well that Ethan and Gertrude were the kind of people who were too lazy to read the details. They only cared about the final result and the prestige. She extended a gold pen she took from her jacket pocket. She briefly explained the sections they needed to sign, saying it was a formality for the transfer of powers and to register their names with the state as the legitimate owners of the new company. She also mentioned that there was an appendix with a list of assets they needed to attach, a standard administrative requirement, including the house Gertrude now occupied, the house stolen from Eleanor, and the luxury cars Ethan used. Ethan casually asked about one of the clauses that seemed particularly long. Madison, quickly and calmly, replied that it was simply an asset protection clause to avoid lawsuits from competitors. A response that actually made no sense, but to someone drunk on greed like Ethan, it sounded perfectly logical. David and his team had drafted the sentences of that contract with diabolical cunning. Behind the beneficial-sounding terms were hidden lethal clauses. These clauses stipulated that the signatories, in this case, the CEO and the chairwoman, agreed to assume the entire pre-existing debt of the company and guaranteed that debt with all their personal assets, without exception, in the event the company could not pay. And in fact, the shell company had already been configured by Madison's financial system to go into default within days. Without reading another word, Ethan grabbed the gold pen. His right hand quickly stamped his signature on the state seal. He signed page after page with enthusiasm, as if he were signing a certificate of wealth when in reality he was signing his own sentence of poverty. When Ethan finished, it was Gertrude's turn. The old woman did not even ask. She just wanted to know where the box for the chairwoman's signature was. With an air of self-importance, Gertrude drew her signature. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper in the silence of the night was like a symphony of victory to Madison's ears. Every stroke of ink was revenge for every tear Eleanor had shed at the market. Once all the documents were signed, Madison reviewed them. Her face remained impassive, hiding the satisfaction that was exploding in her chest. She closed the briefcase firmly, as if sealing the fate of her husband and mother-in-law inside. She said she would take the documents to the notary first thing in the morning to expedite the legal procedures so that the investment funds could be released as soon as possible. Ethan and Gertrude cheered with joy, even hugging each other to celebrate the bright future they imagined. Ethan was already thinking about buying a new sports car, while Gertrude planned to renovate the stolen house to make it even more luxurious and show off to her neighbors. Madison excused herself from the table, saying she had to prepare a presentation for investors the next day. Upon reaching her room, she locked the door. She leaned against the wood, letting out a long sigh. Her legs were trembling after the tension of the charade. She took her phone, photographed the signed documents, and sent them to David. A short message accompanied the photo. "The fish are in the net. Pull." David responded instantly with a thumbs-up icon. Starting the next day, the legal mechanism would be automatically activated. The shell company would receive a demand for payment of its debts from creditors who were actually indirectly affiliated with Madison. And since the company had no funds, the guarantee of its administrator's personal assets would be executed immediately. That night, for the first time in weeks, Madison slept deeply. Meanwhile, in the next room, Ethan was calling Sienna, euphoric, telling her that he was now officially a big boss. Sienna, on the other end, showered him with praise, although deep down, she only cared about when she could enjoy that money. Everyone fell asleep with their own dreams. Ethan and Gertrude dreamed of limitless wealth. Sienna dreamed of a life of luxury without strings attached, but Madison did not dream. Madison woke up with the certainty that justice was about to be served. They had little time left. Tomorrow would be the last day they would enjoy soft mattresses and air conditioning. The day after tomorrow, harsh reality would slap them in the face, waking them from their intoxicating dream of greed. The following night, the luxurious house turned into an ocean of people and falsehood. Gertrude had insisted on throwing a big party to celebrate the new positions. Invitations were sent to all her high society friends, distant relatives, and even neighbors they barely spoke to. She wanted to rub it in the world's face that her family was now richer and more powerful. The decorations were ostentatious, with expensive imported flowers in every corner. A long buffet was laden with delicacies. Classical music played softly, adding a touch of forced elegance. Gertrude, dressed in a shiny silk suit and, of course, the imitation brooch, paraded around like a queen. In another corner, Ethan chatted animatedly with Sienna by his side, whom he introduced as a distant cousin. Madison watched the scene from the top of the stairs with a frigid gaze. It disgusted her that her husband had the audacity to bring his mistress to her own home, but she knew it was the final act of his farce. She smoothed her dress, took a deep breath, and descended the stairs with elegance. Her serene and distinguished presence drew all eyes. Gertrude, feeling overshadowed, took a microphone to give a speech. She praised Ethan to the extreme, but slipped in hurtful comments about Madison, saying that a good wife should bear children, not just dedicate herself to her career. The guests whispered, looking at Madison. Ethan smiled with an air of superiority. Sienna also smiled cynically. Madison did not flinch. She walked forward and asked her mother-in-law for the microphone. She looked at the guests and then at Ethan and Gertrude. In a calm but penetrating voice, she thanked everyone for their presence. She said it was indeed a very special night, one that this family would never forget. And then she whispered, but with the microphone so close that everyone heard it, "Enjoy this expensive meal, because it might be the last luxury meal the hosts will ever serve." Before Ethan and Gertrude could process those words, the front door swung wide open. David entered with a firm step. Behind him were 4 burly men in court, officer uniforms and 2 police officers. The once boisterous party fell into a sepulchral silence. The music stopped. A livid Ethan confronted them, asking who had allowed them to enter. David calmly pulled out some documents. He announced in a clear voice that they were there to proceed with the seizure of the assets presented as collateral based on the breach of contract clause of the company run by Mr. Ethan and Mrs. Gertrude. Ethan let out an incredulous laugh, thinking it was a joke. He yelled that he had just signed the contract the day before and that the money had not even arrived yet. David smiled faintly and explained the legal reality. The document they signed was a transfer of liability for the debt of a company that was already technically bankrupt. With their signatures, they had personally assumed all the debt, and since the company was insolvent, the personal assets presented as collateral had to be seized at that very moment. Ethan's face turned to wax. Gertrude's jaw dropped in a hysterical scream, accusing David of being a con man. The officers began to move. One of them approached Gertrude and demanded that she remove all the jewelry she was wearing, as it was included in the inventory of assets to be seized. Gertrude resisted, but it was useless. She screamed for Madison to help, but Madison stood still, observing the scene with a blank expression. Sienna, seeing the disaster, tried to slip out the back door, but other officers were already guarding the exits. The terrified guests scattered, leaving the party of opulence instantly transformed into the scene of ruin. The officers began to place red stickers with the words, "asset sized" on the furniture, the television, the paintings. Ethan tried to resist, but was subdued by the validity of the court order. David informed them that they had 48 hours to vacate the house completely, but movable assets like jewelry and vehicles had to be surrendered that same night. The keys to the luxury cars Ethan displayed in the garage were taken from him. As their world crumbled, Madison approached the weeping Gertrude and whispered in her ear, reminding her how she had thrown Eleanor out without mercy. "Karma," she said, "never gets the address wrong. It just waits for the right moment to pay a visit." 2 days later, just as the sun was rising, the real nightmare began for the inhabitants of the luxurious house. Ethan woke up bathed in a cold sweat. The air conditioning in his room was dead. He tried to turn on the light, but there was no response. The electricity had been cut off. He staggered to the bathroom to wash his face, but only a hollow hiss came from the faucet. The water had been cut off too. The house was now an empty, lifeless shell. From downstairs came sharp, authoritative knocks on the door. These were not the knocks of a guest, but of an execution. Ethan woke up Sienna, who was sleeping beside him. She got up with a grumpy face, complaining about the heat and thirst. They went downstairs. In the living room, Gertrude was already sitting in a chair with a haggard face, disheveled hair, and swollen eyes. She looked like a lost soul. The front door was forced open from the outside. A group of men in blue work overalls entered, followed by David and several police officers. They were the eviction team. David did not mince words this time. He gave a direct order to his team to move all of Ethan and Gertrude's belongings out to the front lawn. The men worked with brutal speed. The sofa, the table, the clothes from the closets, everything was taken out without care and piled onto the grass. Ethan flew into a rage. He tried to stop a worker who was taking the television, shouting that this was his wife Madison's house and that she would pay for all of this. He started screaming Madison's name, his voice broken with desperation. Then Madison appeared from the kitchen. She was impeccably dressed in an elegant tan suit and carried a small suitcase. Her fresh, serene face contrasted with the chaos around her. Ethan ran to her, grabbed her arm, and begged her to pay off the company's debt with her savings. He was convinced that Madison still had plenty of money left. Madison pulled away from his grip with a sharp gesture. She looked him in the eyes with a coldness that made him cower. In a clear, strong voice, so that Gertrude and Sienna could hear, she said that she had no obligation to pay a single cent of their debts. She took a red folder from her bag and threw it at Ethan's chest. He caught it, trembling. When he opened it, his eyes widened. It was the divorce decree. The lawsuit Madison had filed had been processed in default, as Ethan had never appeared for the court summons, the notifications of which had been cleverly hidden by Madison's people among piles of bills. Legally, before God and man, they were no longer husband and wife since the judge had issued the ruling the previous afternoon. Ethan collapsed, falling to his knees on the floor. He was speechless. Madison continued her explanation in an icy tone. She reminded him of the prenuptial agreement he had signed at the beginning of their marriage, a document he signed without reading, blinded by love. It specified that each spouse's debts were their own personal responsibility, and since he and Gertrude had signed the shell company contract as personal guarantors, Madison's assets were shielded. Furthermore, the portion of marital assets that might have gone to Ethan had already vanished to pay the late fees and interest on the debt. Gertrude, upon hearing this, became hysterical. She crawled to Madison, begging for mercy. She told her she was an old woman, her mother-in-law, and that she deserved respect. Madison bent down, looking at the once arrogant woman. She reminded her of the words Gertrude had used to insult Eleanor, calling her a parasite and a freeloader. "Now," Madison said, "you are the parasite without a host." She motioned to David. He stepped forward and revealed the last and most devastating piece of information. He informed them that this luxurious house had actually been sold in a private bank auction a week ago because Ethan had not paid the property taxes for 2 years. And the buyer, the new and legitimate owner, was an investor of a certain age. Just then, a modest car pulled up in front of the open gate. The door opened, and Eleanor got out. Madison's mother, the one who was forced to rummage through garbage, appeared in clean clothes and with a radiant face. David pointed to Eleanor and said, "She is the new owner." Eleanor had repurchased the house using the secret savings she had accumulated over decades from the inheritance of some ancestral lands she had just sold at a very good price. The money she had always saved for Madison's future and that of her grandchildren. Ethan and Gertrude stared at her, speechless in disbelief. The woman they had humiliated and trampled now held the deed to the house that had been their sanctuary. Eleanor walked slowly across the lawn that was once hers. She looked at her former mother-in-law Gertrude with a mixture of pity and firmness. She did not say a single offensive word, only said quietly that she was going to cleanse the house of all negative energy. She asked the workers to make sure they removed every last one of Ethan and Gertrude's belongings. She did not want a single trace of their evil to remain in her daughter's future home. Sienna, realizing the situation was hopeless, discreetly grabbed her purse and tried to slip away. Madison saw her but let her go. She knew Sienna's fate would be no better, without money, pregnant by another man, and with nowhere to go. Finally, Ethan and Gertrude found themselves standing on the sidewalk in front of the imposing house. Their clothes were stuffed haphazardly into large black trash bags. They had no wallets. Their cards had been blocked. The sun beat down fiercely. Neighbors began to come out of their houses to watch the humiliating spectacle. The whispers were like daggers. Are those the arrogant new rich? Are they being kicked out? Ethan hung his head. The shame was unbearable. Madison came out through the gate and stood beside her mother. She looked at her ex-husband and ex-mother-in-law one last time. She no longer felt resentment, only relief. She slowly closed the tall iron gate. The metallic sound of the latch marked the end of their relationship forever. Ethan and Gertrude were now completely alone in a cruel world, feeling the same thing Eleanor had felt, but with one difference. They had no one who would help them. Ethan, Gertrude, and Sienna walked aimlessly after being kicked out. Their appearance was deplorable. The afternoon sun beat down on them. Hunger began to take its toll. They had not had a bite to eat in almost 24 hours. They did not have a single cent. Their phones had been confiscated. Finally, their steps led them to Madison's office building. The glass tower rose majestically. They tried to enter the lobby, but the security guard, who recognized Ethan, blocked their path. The orders were clear. They ended up sitting on the curb by the parking garage exit, waiting for Madison's compassion. A short time later, a sleek black sedan emerged from the garage. It was Madison's car. Ethan lunged at it. The car braked sharply. The rear window slowly rolled down. Inside was Madison, her face fresh and serene, and beside her, Eleanor, looking healthy and calm. The difference between those inside and those outside was an abyss. The trio surrounded the window. The smell of sweat and dirt from their bodies must have invaded the perfumed interior. Ethan began to beg with a broken voice. He asked for forgiveness. He said it had been a mistake, that he would change. Gertrude joined the pleas, crying her eyes out, saying she was a sick old woman. Sienna, normally so haughty, lowered her head, hoping Madison would toss them a few bills. Madison listened to them without blinking. When they finished, she smiled slightly. She said she had heard their complaints about being hungry. She picked up something from the car floor, a large, well-tied black plastic bag. Ethan and Gertrude's eyes shone, thinking it contained food or money. Madison handed the bag to Ethan. He took it with trembling hands. "Here is your food," Madison said in a low but firm voice. "A special menu, exactly the same one you forced my mother to eat for months." With his heart in his throat, Ethan untied the knot. Instantly, a nauseating stench escaped the bag, hitting them in the face. Inside, there was no money or sandwiches. There were rotting and slimy vegetable scraps, mushy chard, crushed tomatoes that released a sour liquid, yellowish leaves collected from the market's garbage. Ethan gasped, his stomach turning. He looked at Madison in disbelief. Gertrude covered her nose, screaming in disgust. Sienna turned her face away, fighting the urge to vomit. Madison stared at them and said, "That is what my mother ate while you enjoyed steaks in luxury restaurants. Now taste it. Eat what you have sown." Without waiting for a response, she rolled up the window. The driver stepped on the accelerator, leaving Ethan petrified, holding the trash bag. The exhaust smoke blew in their faces, like the final touch to a perfect humiliation. Ethan slammed the bag onto the asphalt, and its contents spilled out. He screamed in frustration, cursing Madison, but his voice was lost in the roar of traffic. The hunger in their stomachs sharpened, now mixed with an unbearable moral pain. Karma was real, and its taste was far more bitter than gall. The night grew deeper, and a sharp wind began to blow, bringing a cold that chilled the three human beings huddled in the doorway of a closed appliance store to the bone. The dim light of a street lamp was their only companion. Ethan, hugging his knees, stared blankly at the road that was beginning to empty. His stomach ached, twisting with hunger. Gertrude lay on a piece of cardboard they had found in a dumpster. Her elderly body trembled with cold, and she kept moaning her son's name, asking for a blanket that did not exist. Sienna, sitting a little apart, her face contorted with anxiety and calculation. This situation was not part of her life plans. She had imagined herself as a millionaire's wife, not a homeless woman sleeping on the street. The tension between them grew slowly. Hunger and desperation turned their emotions into a tinderbox. It all started with a sarcastic comment from Sienna about Ethan's incompetence in handling the company documents, to which he responded with a wild shout. He blamed her, calling her a bearer of bad luck. He snapped that by following her whims and her advice to divorce Madison and falsify the assets, he had now lost everything. He threw in her face that he had sacrificed a perfect woman like Madison for someone like her. And this was the result. The echo of their fight broke the silence of the night, but no one cared. Sienna, tired of being the scapegoat, finally exploded. She stood up and looked at Ethan with a contempt he had never seen before. Until now, she had always pretended to be sweet and syrupy. But that night, the mask fell off completely. She let out a cynical laugh, a sound that seemed eerie to Ethan. She shouted that he was the stupidest man she had ever met. And then she revealed the big secret she had guarded so carefully. She said she had never loved him for a second. She had approached him solely for his money and because it was part of a job. Sienna confessed that she was actually the mistress of one of Ethan's former business rivals and had been deliberately planted to destroy his marriage and his focus on business from within. Ethan was left speechless, unable to utter a sound. That mental blow was much harder than hunger, but Sienna was not finished. She caressed her bulging belly and smiled maliciously. She said that the child she was carrying was not his blood at all. That baby belonged to a real boyfriend, who was in jail on a drug charge. She needed the figure of a rich father to support her and her child, and Ethan, with his mental weakness and his dependence on his mother, had been the easiest target. Upon hearing this, Ethan's world collapsed. His male pride was trampled into dust. He had thrown away a diamond to pick up a mud-covered pebble. He had betrayed Madison, his loyal and devoted wife, for a professional con artist who, moreover, was disgusted by him. Gertrude, who heard the confession from her cardboard bed, sat up abruptly. Her face turned red with explosive rage. She tried to get up to attack Sienna, to pull out the hair of the woman who had deceived her son, but her strength failed her. Sienna easily brushed aside Gertrude's wrinkled hand, causing the old woman to fall back onto the cardboard. She snorted in annoyance and then saw her last chance. As she fell, Gertrude's left hand was exposed. On her ring finger, she still wore the only gold ring she had left, her old wedding ring, so tight that it had been impossible to remove during the seizure and which the officers had overlooked. It was the only valuable object they possessed. Without hesitation, Sienna pounced on Gertrude's hand. She pulled the ring with force, ripping it from the swollen finger. Gertrude screamed in pain, begging her not to take it, that it was her last hope to buy some food. Ethan tried to get up to help his mother, but his body, weakened by shock and hunger, did not respond. With infinite cruelty, Sienna spat on Gertrude's hand after getting the ring. She said that ring was her payment for having put up with Ethan for all that time. She added that she was not willing to continue being a homeless person with a couple of losers. With the ring in her hand, she could sell it on the black market the next morning and buy a bus ticket to get out of town and start a new scam. She turned and walked away into the darkness of the night, without looking back. Ethan could only watch as her silhouette faded, taking with it the last vestiges of his dignity. The sound of Sienna's footsteps was lost as she turned the corner, leaving behind a chilling silence. Ethan crawled to his mother. Gertrude was still sobbing, holding the finger that was bleeding from the pull. Suddenly, her breathing became ragged. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsed, and then she became rigid. Her mouth twisted, and her words became an unintelligible mumble. Ethan panicked. He realized his mother was having a stroke, brought on by the shock and the rise in blood pressure. He hugged his mother's semi-paralyzed body, crying out loud in that cold doorway. He screamed for help, but the streets were deserted. There were no doctors, no medicine, no ambulance that would come to pick up a poor, unidentified person in the middle of the night. Ethan finally felt absolute helplessness. He remembered how he had let Eleanor get sick without medicine, how he had laughed at the poverty of others. Now, under the pale moonlight, he hugged his mother, trying to keep her warm while cursing his stupidity and his unforgivable sins. Tears of repentance ran down his cheeks, but they could no longer change the fact that they had hit rock bottom, shattered, with nothing left. A year had passed since the storm had swept through Madison's life. Time had brought profound changes. Madison's business was now an empire, expanding internationally. Her name was synonymous with success, one of the most influential and respected businesswomen. Known for her strength and humility, her more serene and elegant appearance reflected the inner peace she had found. There was no longer a trace of sadness on her face. Her relationship with David had also blossomed. After a respectful and formal courtship, David had finally dared to ask for her hand from Eleanor. Eleanor, with tears of happiness, had accepted, seeing in David the upright and God-fearing man her daughter deserved. On the other hand, the seized mansion, once a nest of greed, was now a thriving orphanage and study center that brought life to the neighborhood. Her old childhood home, beautifully restored, was now the happy home where she and her mother lived. In another part of the city, the wheel of fortune turned in the opposite direction. In the same market where Madison found her mother, a skeletal man with sun-scorched skin and dressed in rags was carrying heavy sacks. His bones were prominent, his face was gaunt, and his eyes were empty. It was Ethan. After getting out of prison on parole, no one would give him a job. His old friends turned their backs on him. Sienna had vanished. He had ended up as a day laborer for a wage that barely bought him a sandwich. Not far from there, next to a garbage dumpster surrounded by flies, an old woman sat in a broken wheelchair. Her body was twisted, one hand gnarled and the other outstretched, holding a rusty can. Her hair, once dyed and styled, was now a dirty gray tangle. She babbled disconnected words, sometimes cursing, sometimes crying. It was Gertrude. After leaving the public hospital, she had become a beggar in the care of a son who could barely take care of himself. That afternoon, a gleaming white car parked nearby. Madison and Eleanor got out. They came, as they did every Friday, to distribute food and aid to the workers and the homeless at the market. A radiant Madison and her smiling mother were received with gratitude and blessings. Ethan, while carrying a sack of onions, saw the commotion. His eyes fixed on the figure who was the center of attention, his heart stopped. It was Madison, the angel he had thrown away. A wave of shame, heavier than any sack, crushed him. He looked at himself, dirty, smelly, miserable, and looked at her, clean, dignified, celestial. He could not bear the sight. He turned around, pulled his cap down, and hid behind some boxes, trembling, holding back a belated cry. The distance between them was no longer social, it was the distance that separates heaven from hell. Meanwhile, Gertrude, seeing the food distribution, tried to move her wheelchair. Her myopic eyes vaguely recognized Eleanor. Her twisted mouth tried to call her name. Her hand waved weakly, seeking attention, forgiveness, or perhaps a rescue, but her voice was drowned out in the bustle. People ignored her, seeing her only as an annoying beggar. Madison saw them. Her gaze caught Ethan hiding and Gertrude pleading in her chair. Her heart felt a chill, not of pity, but of gratitude for the palpable divine justice. She paused for a moment. Eleanor also looked in the same direction. Their eyes met. They knew that giving them money now would only feed a sickness of the soul that was not yet healed. The market had to be their school, for as long as God determined. Madison took her mother's hand and whispered, "Let us go, Mom. Our work here is done." They turned and walked with a firm step toward their car. They did not look back. They left Ethan crying in his hiding place and Gertrude with an empty hand. The car door closed, forever sealing the separation between two worlds. The engine started smoothly, carrying Madison and Eleanor away from a past that was now just dust in the rearview mirror of their lives. Inside the cool, fragrant car, Eleanor asked softly, "Are you satisfied, my daughter? Is your heart at peace seeing them like this?" Madison smiled, a smile of serenity, not of triumph. She adjusted the silk scarf at her neck and answered sweetly, "It is not about the satisfaction of revenge, Mom. It is about justice. God has balanced everything on the most precise scale. My duty is done. Now I just want to focus on making you happy and building our future." The car accelerated, making its way toward a radiant tomorrow, leaving behind the shadows of a yesterday that had finally found its place, the landfill of history.